Hello, everybody. Today I am going to be taking you through the third and final part of my research into a historical phenomenon called the Board for the Protection of Women, which was a program that came up out of fascist Spain that more broadly is pointing to this complicity that seems to exist or has existed between states and religious congregations to essentially control people's lives. In this case, specifically women and girls. If this is the first video of mine that you are clicking on, hi, my name is Beck, and like I said, this is the Deep Dive Project, which is my venture in independent citizen journalism and research. I make an effort to share everything that I am reading with everyone here, so for today, as an example, you can access all the articles that I have been reading in a source document down below. My goal is to equip my audience with information and a desire to learn more, because we have the world at our fingertips right now thanks to access to the internet, and I am always saying and truly believe that ignorance is a luxury that we and billions of other people can simply no longer afford. So my hope is that you will use my content here as a springboard to start doing your own research and asking your own questions. It is an incredibly empowering thing to do and has made me feel like I am moving through the world as a more aware person, and that has been a very, very good feeling. And so I hope that my work here can encourage you to do the same, because I do believe in education and knowledge. I think that they can set us free. So with that said, I do want to issue a quick content warning. As with most things that I discuss here on the Deep Dive Project, the topics that we're going to be getting into today may not be appropriate for all audiences, so viewer discretion is advised, and please keep your own mental health in mind at all times. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. The first article that I'm going to be reading from today was published on La Maria. It's a historical piece, and the headline says, "The Board for the Protection of Women, Complicity Between the State and Religious Congregations to Redeem Wayward Young Women." Historian Carmen Guillen has published "Redeem and Indoctrinate: The Patronage for the Protection of Women" in 2026. The essay shows how a system of repression was organized in which society played a fundamental role. I feel like this is an incredibly important historical event that everyone, but especially women, should know about. We need to know about cases in recent recorded history where governments have tried to trample on the rights of its people, have succeeded in trampling on those rights, and how they have done it, the means by which that was facilitated, are all very important, because those same systems and those same attitudes that put these people in the situations that they found themselves in are still around today. They didn't die off. They're not extinct like the dinosaurs. They are still being fostered and kept alive in different communities all around the world, and it feels to me like a number of these people are now, at least in my country, trying very, very hard to influence and shape policy and social discourse in a way that, in my view, does not actually do anything to support and uplift minorities, women, children, really anyone who isn't a straight white male, frankly. So I want to tell you about this. That's why I have been bringing this to everyone's attention, because this kind of thing seems wild. There's the expression, nobody ever expects a Spanish Inquisition, but it happened. And it was facilitated by some very specific people in very specific places. And it all ties in to research that I have been doing here on the Deep Dive Project for years. So I will read. "That morning she woke up in Barcelona as usual, although this time accompanied by her mother and a doctor from Opus Dei. They told her she needed a flu shot. The next day, Consuelo Garcia del Cid Guerrera woke in Madrid, confined to a home. She was only 16 years old. She didn't yet know she was in the Adoratrices Reformatory in Madrid. She is one of tens of thousands of young women who passed through the Patronato de Protección a la Mujer, the Board for the Protection of Women, which was active from 1941 to 1985. So within a very recent period of time, this was still around and still controlling people's lives, or trying to. I mean, I understand 1985 might seem like a long time ago to some people, especially Gen Z and Gen Alpha, but in the like broad scope of just like recorded history, it was quite literally just the other day. This Francoist institution survived for more than 4 decades thanks to the support and tireless work of religious congregations. They pursued only one goal: to correct the wayward, the wicked, the vicious. And these are all titles that they gave to specific groups of people that they had a problem with. The lack of documentation on this Francoist institution is something historian Carmen Guillen has faced, and she has now published Redeem and Indoctrinate: The Patronage for the Protection of Women. The monograph is a comprehensive essay that condenses the few known facts about it, testimonies from victims, and extensive research into its history. Quote, "The objective was to redeem fallen women and help those in danger of falling, which over time materialized into a prison exclusively for women," she summarizes. Guillen, who also teaches the history of science at the Faculty of Medicine in Albacete, part of the University of Castilla-La Mancha, UCLM, emphasizes that it was women between the ages of 16 and 25 who typically ended up confined, almost kidnapped, at the Patronato, where there were also instances of stolen babies and forced labor. Their stays lasted from 6 months to 2 years, and the institution had a very rigid structure. The 52 provincial boards, which in turn were formed by the local boards, originated from the national board in Madrid. The specialist points to the religious congregations as the fundamental pillar for the Patronato function. Here, Francoist National Catholicism has one of its clearest and most enduring examples, she adds. Thus, what nuns had been doing for centuries to redeem wayward women became state policy in 20th century Spain. Any woman who did not conform to the ideal woman model created by Francoism, submissive, decent, at the service of the home and husband, with no greater life horizon than caregiving and perhaps the church, could enter these centers of supposed protection that became networks of repression, Guillen explains. You may have seen it if you are subscribed or you've been following my content. I recently had a piece that I read. It was an undercover investigation out of the UK. Somebody went undercover pretending to be someone interested in Opus Dei to a women's center in the UK called Lakefield, and she wrote an entire investigative piece about her experience, the things that she heard, what she was exposed to. And in that investigative report, which was published by the Daily Mail, there was a picture of the front door, or one of the doors anyway, one of the entrances to this Lakefield facility, and it specifically noted how there was a thumbprint reader over top of the door, indicating, of course, that you have to have biometric approval in order to be able to enter the building. And I had reason to question whether or not there was a thumb reader on the other side for exiting the building. I don't know. I have no way of proving it. It's just something that I wondered about based on what I was reading and everything, what I have heard about how people inside of Opus Dei, the individuals actually living in the Opus Dei centers and houses and things, the extent to which their day-to-day life and comings and goings are restricted and controlled. And someone in the comments section of that video said, well, isn't that just like nuns, living behind walls and being locked away from the world? And it was so funny that they said that day, because I had just read this article for the first time where it specifically talks about how what nuns had been doing for centuries to redeem wayward women became state policy in 20th century Spain. So yeah, it is the same thing as nuns, at least in some cases. And that probably, the experience and the historical human rights record of women within religious communities more broadly is something that I think needs to be explored far more deeply and with greater critical attention than has been done up to now. Because they're talking about, at least in this case, this board for the protection of women was run by religious and had people affiliated with organizations like Opus Dei helping out, propping it up, helping to get people to come peacefully, young women and girls to come peaceably into these various centers and everything. And I just have to ask, what are they protecting these women and girls from? was it ever really about protecting women and girls? It doesn't really seem like it. It seems more like, to me, it seems more like it was about protecting Francoist society from free thinking and independent women and girls who do not fall into line with the prevalent groupthink of the time. I feel like the name is kind of a self-tell, which is not uncommon. Dissent in women, whether moral or political, was punished with imprisonment. From its inception in the immediate post-war period, the Patronato underwent only one legal modification before its dissolution. This occurred in 1952 when the regime granted the institution greater power. As Professor Guillen accounts in her book, from then on, the Patronato could strip parents of their parental rights in certain circumstances, thus preventing them from removing their daughters from the institutions. I don't know if it's in this article or in another article, if I've read it already or if we'll be getting to it, but there is a story that I read throughout all of this from a young woman who was brought to one of these centers, these facilities, these concentration camps, for lack of a better term, for women, by her own parents as a teenager. They brought her here because they had problems with her behavior and her diversion of opinion and perspective from their own. And so they took her themselves and locked her up, handed her over. And I have to think that that probably wasn't uncommon. I bet that there were parents who did this thinking that they were legitimately doing the right thing, and only upon actually handing their child over, having the scales actually fall from their eyes, seeing it for what it was. So of course there had to be some mechanism in place to prevent parents from coming to their senses and pulling their children out. And it's no big deal for a government created entity to create barriers and take away, strip rights from parents, from caregivers, which is really, really scary. Consuelo Garcia del Cid Guerrera, born in 1958, comes from a Catholic bourgeois family in Barcelona. From a young age, she rejected the roles imposed upon her and soon began to mobilize against the regime. In 1974, at the age of 14, she attended the protests against the garroting of Salvador Puig Antich. This marked the beginning of her opposition to the regime. A year later, in March 1975, she woke up at number 52 Padre Damian Street in Madrid. Quote, "For my family to have someone like me, a leftist, was seen as worse than being a prostitute or a drug addict," she explains at 67. Women like her who ended up at the Patronato were called the wayward ones. There were also single mothers, poor women, orphans, daughters of prisoners, prostitutes, and rebels. According to MCG's file from June 1943, she was interned because she sized too much for men, which is in quotes. There were others taken to the centers for wearing a miniskirt or smoking in the street. Many others weren't even under the Patronato's guardianship. That was Garcia's case. Quote, "My family paid to keep me there. It's like imprisoning someone and making their family pay for the cell." Which goes, I think, to show the extent to which the Franco government was expecting the cooperation and support of its citizens. And I wonder, like, I wonder how willingly these families were paying for their daughters' like prison cells, basically. If that was something that like they opted to do because they wanted to, or if it was something that was done somewhat under duress, like this entire situation where people were sort of forced to conform and to go along, or risk all kinds of like negative social and even like civil retributions. Inside, psychological abuse was a constant occurrence, along with physical punishment such as being forced to sleep outdoors, cleaning the floor by making crosses with their tongues, or having nettles applied to the genital area of those who wet the bed. Guillen elaborates that the inmates remember above all the humiliations and abuse they endured, as well as the hunger, the cold, and the punishments they suffered if their escape attempts failed. And so, because of all of that, I think you can see why I am a bit dubious of this entire program being called the Board for the Protection of Women, because from my view, it wasn't protecting women from anything. If anything, it opened women and girls up to more abuse and more harm, psychological, physical, emotional, and spiritual. It wasn't protecting them from anything. And I have to venture to guess it did not end up netting the results that the Franco regime was hoping that it would. And now they are left trying to pick up the pieces of their life. I also think that the accounts of the punishments that these women and girls had to endure, the things that were done to them, again, adds so much to my theory and my belief that this was never done to protect women and girls. It was to protect the Franco regime from women and girls who did not agree with the things that they were doing. I mentioned in the past episodes that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. There is a reason why authoritarian governments of a variety of shades, but all authoritarian governments, want to control women and want to control the decisions that women make, particularly when it comes to our bodies and our reproductive rights. There is a reason why Franco wanted to round all of these young women up and send them into these centers to be corrected. And it wasn't for any reason other than, in my opinion and to my belief, based on what I have read, protecting fascism in Spain, which is something that has to constantly be like shored up and protected, because it's not a very natural way to live. It ends up consuming itself in the end. Like, fascist regimes have never stuck around for very long. They've always ended up crumbling and falling apart, oftentimes in large part because of the actions and decisions of the citizens. Garcia describes the life inside these centers as horrible. Furthermore, the inmates were forbidden from revealing to each other the reason for their admission. Quote, "We weren't free to talk to each other. They monitored how long you took in the shower, and your privacy was reduced to the toilet. No one who has been through a Patronato reformatory comes out the same," asserts the Barcelona native. "Self-harm was commonplace. Your body craved physical pain to forget the psychological pain inflicted upon you," she adds. "Suicide attempts and escapes were also frequent." In the first video that I made talking about all of this, the first article in that video talks about the death of a 15-year-old child in around 1985 when she plummeted 3 stories from one of these facilities that was still operational, plummeted to her death in her underwear. Very strange circumstances, very, very strange conditions, but that was what alerted the public to the fact that this was still going on. And because so many other strides had already been made in Spain and elsewhere towards people's rights and women's rights more specifically, this was completely shut down and dismantled at that point. But it took a little girl falling very publicly 3 stories to her death in her underwear for people to wake up and start paying attention, because this had been going on for so long that it had just kind of fallen beneath the radar and was continuing to just cruise along, which unfortunately is how so many of these things happen. There is another horrific situation that I am planning on getting into and doing a similar thing that I've been doing with this Patronato case, the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. If you don't know about the Magdalene laundries and what happened and how it was all found out, you should really do some research. Or you can just subscribe, because I will be talking about that at some point. The similarities between that and this program here are too similar for me to think that, like, they're not fruits of the same poisonous tree, frankly. I also think that it is interesting the control mechanisms that these victim survivors talk about experiencing, being forced to self-isolate, being discouraged or prohibited from talking to each other, from having relationships, monitoring every single moment of their life. It sounds like prison, but it also, to me, sounds like what so many former victim survivor members of Opus Dei have talked about experiencing. In Opus Dei, members are also discouraged from having friendships with each other, to not cultivate particular friendships is the internal jargon that they use. Mail has been reported to be censored. People's phone calls are listened to People are never allowed to go anywhere by themselves unless, they have gained some sort of special privilege, but many are expected to be accompanied by another member of Opus Dei at all times, everywhere they go. And internally, there seems to be this attitude of self-policing that has gone just completely out of control. And so you have a situation, I believe, in Opus Dei where the members are themselves both the prisoners and the prison guards. And that creates a very unique kind of psychological trauma. And so I don't think that it's entirely surprising that within Opus Dei, you see this preoccupation and fascination with corporal mortification. Everyone knows about how, it's been widely reported about how Opus Dei members whip themselves with a cloth whip, about how they wear a spiked chain around their upper thigh called a cilice, how this is all done to mortify the flesh, blah, blah, blah. But I have also talked to former members who have said that these corporal mortifications are oftentimes taken to extremes by the members, taken far beyond just what is sort of set out in like the guidelines of the like Opus Dei internal like regulations or whatever, taking it to a point where they are actually causing lasting physical damage and harm. And it's not surprising to me, really, on a certain level, if that is happening, and of course I'm taking victim survivors and their first person testimonies and accounts at face value, and I'm listening to them when they're saying this. I have never witnessed this for myself. I can't verify that this is true. This is what I have heard reported on extensively, repeatedly, and it's not surprising to me given how controlling as an organization Opus Dei seems to be. And isn't it interesting, just to bring it all back to what we're talking about right now, that Opus Dei was also involved in this whole patronato thing to some extent. Maybe it was just on the outskirts. Maybe it was only Opus Dei psychiatrists coming in to drug people and dope people up so that they could be taken in. Maybe they weren't the ones actually running the show and like directing this program. But historically, that's kind of been the way that Opus Dei seems to work, in my view. Like they hover on the fringes. They're always around somewhere. Like I feel like you can pretty much count on it, but they're never going to be at the very epicenter. Because I think that they realize on an institutional level that kind of thing would be suicide, organizational suicide, if they were to do that, which is why there are these members who are responsible for these corporate works that seem to have no affiliation with Opus Dei as an organization, and Opus Dei says that they have no interest in them. And of course, I believe, in my opinion, that is a bunch of bullshit, but I think it is so interesting that Opus Dei is involved in some way or shape and form in this historical account, and that you have people talking about how rigid and controlling the environment it was, and how you'd have people talking about how they were resorting to self-harm, which at a certain point, I think corporal mortification becomes self-harm. The similarities are incredibly interesting to me. If you're picking up on any of that, let me know down below. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. For me, from my perspective, it's just a sign, a symptom of the fact that Opus Dei as an organization came up out of Franco's fascist Spain, and there are so many facets of its like hierarchical like structure and the underpinnings of how everything works, like going back to the writings of the founder Jose Maria Escrivá. The similarities and everything are not really so surprising because it was like baked in this environment that was so incredibly controlling and rigid. So if the organization wanted to gain a toehold, succeed, and be able to achieve the kind of influence and prestige that its founder seemed to envision for it, well, it makes sense to fall in line and curry favor with the new government that's currently in power. And oh, by the way, this is not something that they have only done in Franco's Spain. I've talked extensively about how this organization continues to pop up in civil discourse, in government, how it has inserted itself into education and everything. And it's a part of how the whole thing works. And I just wanted to point out those similarities because, again, they're fascinating to me. Maternity centers were one of the types of facilities included in the patronato. Quote, forced adoptions and the theft of babies were commonplace there. Women were driven to it by the pressures they faced. They were told they wouldn't be good mothers and that without financial means, they wouldn't be able to care for the children, the historian points out. In a way, the state and the church were jointly deciding who could or could not be a good mother. So, in case you were wondering, taking children from their parents and selling them, in case you were wondering, that's human trafficking. The Catholic Church is more than complicit in human trafficking. And you should know that. Specifically, they're complicit in stealing children from their mother's arms and selling them. That is important, and we cannot forget that. For all that this organization has made strides to begin redressing wrongs, they have a 2,000-year paper trail of abuse to contend with, and human trafficking is a part of that. And when the state and the church, in this case, the Catholic Church, are the ones deciding who can and cannot be free, who can and cannot live their life, who can and cannot make decisions about their own bodies and whether or not that they have children, that is authoritarianism at its most extreme and contributed to the reason why the country that I live in today was settled and established as a republic. A republic if we could keep it. Redemption also involved forced labor, the profits from which were managed by religious congregations. In some cases, women received training in trades considered feminine, such as embroidery or mending. According to Guillen, their garments were even sold to major brands. The nuns didn't become so wealthy from this work. Rather, they used the money to subsist within the convents because they were always plagued by financial problems, the historian adds. And so I think that points to an interesting through line, an interesting element of exploitation that runs throughout like this entire story, from the women and the girls who are the victims to the religious women who were running these centers and controlling and abusing these women. They were themselves part of a system where they were potentially disenfranchised and significantly, at least, at financial risk because of the fact that they didn't have money. That creates desperation. When people don't have their basic needs met, food, water, shelter, when they are not able to afford those things because of the state of affairs, whatever they may be, that creates a degree of desperation that I think will drive people to do some absolutely insane things. And I think we have to kind of bear that in mind, because while I am not excusing or anything the actions of these religious women, I think that it is important to remember that they probably were not terribly free, autonomous individuals either. And that, I think, points to a larger, like, organizational or institutional issue within the Catholic Church that I would dearly like to believe it no longer exists, or is no longer prevalent. But I don't know that I can believe that, because I don't know that I am really seeing proof positive of that being the case. I've commented in previous episodes that it seems to me that in general, within the Catholic Church, most Catholics, lay Catholics, non-religious, who are just trying to live their Catholic life and observe Sundays, holy days of obligation, they are often not the most well versed in the rights that they as lay people have in relationship with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And lay people absolutely do have rights. They're supposed to have rights within the Catholic Church according to the Catholic Church's canon law, but based on all of the research that I've done, these situations that I continue to learn about, these exploitative crimes that are carried out against entire groups of people, it gives me cause to pause and wonder whether or not Catholics are actually aware of their rights and empowered to exercise them. It doesn't really seem like that is the case, and that adds another layer of complexity and another issue to this entire thing, because I think it's been that way for a while, unfortunately. On the day Franco died, Garcia was at the Adoratrices convent. She thought everything was going to change, but it didn't. I had helped many women escape, so I planned my own escape, which had to be perfect, and it was. On April 2nd, 1976, I escaped. She recalls, man, they should make a TV show about this situation. I would watch it. Can you just, like, modern day Handmaid's Tale, like literally needing to escape, planning this perfect escape after you've helped all these other people escape. Like, that's something I would tune in for. That's something that deserves to like be memorialized in like legend. She couldn't even survive alone in Madrid, so she turned to an aunt for help. I ended up on a plane to Barcelona. There, my family put me back in the Buen Pastor women's home, she says. She doesn't know the exact month, but that same year she was finally released from the institution. However, she does know that the progressive priest, as she called him, who saved her, quote, I owe my freedom to Father Agustin Viñas Rejac, and I will be grateful to him for the rest of my life. Guillen emphasizes that one of the key pillars that sustained the Patronato even after Francisco Franco's death, society was crucial. The Francoist discourse on women was so deeply ingrained that anyone who didn't accept it could be ostracized by neighbors and family members. And that brings me back to what I had said earlier about women and girls being turned over by their families and wondering like the extent to which their families were actually in control of like making that decision. Sounds like it was pretty all-encompassing and pretty untenable. On many other occasions, not even the parents knew where their daughters were being taken. The girls would then communicate with them by telephone, with a nun monitoring the conversation, or through letters that were sent and received open once the nun's censorship had been bypassed. It's no coincidence that the threat to young children that if you misbehave, you'll be sent to the nuns, has taken root in the social consciousness. Decades later, what remains is a silenced memory that slowly is regaining its breath, but also its scars. Guillen has found a common thread in the testimonies she has gathered. The women speak of problems such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. They left there feeling guilty, Garcia explains. In her case, the post-traumatic stress manifests as a debilitating vertigo that prevents her from riding the subway or going down certain stairs alone. Unraveling the significance of the Patronato is a complex undertaking. Although 1,183 boxes of documents were initially preserved, the archive where they were stored was flooded. Today, only 31 boxes remain. There are no exact figures. There are no names. Guillen estimates that towards the end of the Franco dictatorship in 1975, there were around 100 centers affiliated with the Patronato de Protección de la Mujer. In June 2025, the Spanish Conference of Religious, which unites 403 religious congregations in Spain, publicly apologized to the survivors of the Patronato. More and more voices are recalling that period of insidious violence precisely to better understand where we come from. Garcia began in 2009 with her testimonies in books. The titles are all here. There's a number of them. There's other people who've also written books on the subject, and podcast producer Isabel Cardenas dedicated several episodes of her program, That's Not Spoken Of, to the board. Guillen was born just 3 years after the end of the Patronato de Protección a la Mujer, a decade after the dictator's death. Quote, I wish that knowing history would help us not to repeat it, but I don't think that's true. What history helps us to understand is ourselves and find our place in the world we live in. We are daughters and granddaughters of this generation of women, and in some way, we carry the weight of their history on our shoulders, she concludes. You can find this article linked down below if you would like to read it. I thought it was incredibly well done and gave a wonderful overview of this entire situation. Shout out to Guillermo Martinez for writing this article. The next one that I'm going to read is from the BBC. This was published on November 15th, 2025. The headline says, My mom was a 17-year-old free spirit, so she was locked up and put in a coma. We are not quite done. There is more stories to hear, and I make an effort in everything that I do to center the experiences of victim survivors, because I believe if we want to know if we want to understand these situations and how they played out and the impact that they had on the people who are living through it, we have to center and talk to those who have the firsthand experience, the victim survivors and their family members. And so that is why I continue to bring up articles like this that present victim survivors and the experiences that they had. It's as close to, at least for this, it's as close to primary source information as I can get. Marina Freya always knew that there was something dark and unspoken about her family. Her mother had grown up under Spain's decade-long dictatorship, which ended in 1975, but the details of her childhood were hazy. Then, everything changed one Christmas a decade ago when Marina was about 20. That evening, around the table with a cloud of cigarette smoke suspended in the air and wine glasses drained, Marina's mother, Mariona Roca Tort, began to speak. My parents reported me to the authorities, Mariona told them. They put me in a reformatory when I was 17. Reformatories were institutions where girls and young women who refused to conform to the Franco regime's Catholic values were detained. Single mothers, girls with boyfriends, lesbians. Girls who'd been sexually assaulted were incarcerated, assuming the blame for their own abuse. Orphans and abandoned girls might also find themselves living behind convent walls. Marina and her cousins were stunned. They couldn't comprehend that their grandparents had arranged to have their own daughter locked up. Yeah, that's really got to tarnish your perception of grandpa and grandma after that. Mariona's memory of telling this story to the youngsters in her family is blurred. She believes, as a result of the psychiatric treatment she was forced to undergo at the reformatory. But Marina didn't forget the revelations, and years later, she would make a documentary telling her mother's story. Mariona is a survivor of the Patronato de Protección a la Mujer. Under dictator Francisco Franco, it oversaw a nationwide network of residential institutions managed by religious organizations. There's no definitive information about how many institutions were involved or how many girls were affected. Let that sink in. We can safely assume that it was in the thousands. We have no real way of knowing, partially because the record has been destroyed, partially because the record was never properly kept in the first place, and partially because such is the nature of trauma for many people when they finally extricate themselves from a situation, returning to that over and over again and trying to be the whistleblower for the problems that are within that is something that oftentimes is simply like it's beyond people. People have to try to put their lives back together, and so these things are never discussed, and it's really, really, really sad. Thursday will mark 50 years since Franco's death. Hallelujah. Spain has since seen a revolution in women's rights, but survivors of the Patronato are still waiting for answers and are now demanding an inquiry, as well they should. Mariona, the oldest of 9 siblings, describes her parents as right-wing and ultra-Catholic. They were so conservative they wouldn't even let Mariona wear trousers. But in 1968, when she turned 16, a new world unfolded. Mariona was tutoring children during the day and preparing for university at evening classes. There, she says, she met people she'd never encountered before: trade unionists, left-wingers, and anti-Franco activists. It was the year of global protests against authoritarianism and the Vietnam War, with mass demands for civil rights. The spirit of revolt was infectious. Franco had been in power for 3 decades. Political parties were banned, censorship was universal, and young people wanted change. Soon, Mariona joined her new friends on raids. A few of them would block off a street, throw Molotov cocktails, hand out leaflets, and when the police turned up, scatter in every direction. On May Day 1969, one of Mariona's friends was arrested at a demonstration in Barcelona. There was a risk that the detainee would give names to the police, so Mariona couldn't go home in case they came looking for her. That night, she stayed in the flat of a fellow activist. Returning home the next day, Mariona was in deep trouble. Her parents were furious and began to exert far more control over her life. For them, it was a scandal, a stain on the family, she says. After that, they wouldn't let me out. By the end of that summer, Mariona had resolved to leave home and traveled to the holiday island of Minorca with some college friends, leaving her parents a note. They immediately reported her as an underage runaway to the authorities, and the moment Mariona was found about to board a boat back to Barcelona, she was arrested. At the port in Barcelona, her parents met her. They didn't take her home. Instead, they took her to a convent. Mariona wasn't given any explanation. She only remembers her parents' rage. Days later, she flew to Madrid with her father. There, she was driven directly to another convent, part of the Patronado system under Spain's Ministry of Justice. She and the other interned women were categorized and segregated. Mariona says she ended up on the first floor, reserved for the rebellious ones, the ones they considered fallen women. 16-year-old girl, apparently a fallen woman, for disagreeing with the political discourse of the time. And her parents are the ones that turned her over. And, you know, I really have to pause and think, because I think it's important to point out that for a lot of us women living in 21st century America right now, were it not for the fact that we'd been born in the time period that we have, in the country that we have, that this could have just as easily happened to any of us. I grew up in a very conservative, strict religious environment. I also was not allowed to wear pants when I was growing up. I didn't wear pants until I was probably 10 or 11 years old. I wasn't allowed to cut my hair. Media was very, very strictly controlled. Only TV on the weekends, and only, it wasn't even TV, it was, you know, VHS tapes or DVDs that we picked out from the library. We didn't have cable TV. We had no secular influence from the outside world. My parents were very, very much trying to raise their family in line with, like, conservative Catholic values. And I see threads of authoritarianism running through the environment that I was raised in, and I see the same thing represented here. And I have to acknowledge the fact that this could have just as easily happened to me if I had been born during this period of time. It could have happened to any of us. It is natural and normal for a teenager to begin forming their own ideas, to begin distancing themselves from their parents, and to begin identifying more with their peer group instead of with their parents. That is a normal and healthy change that is supposed to happen throughout adolescence. It's what helps you become your own independent person. But within certain communities, that type of independence is a threat. It's a threat to the entire system and structure of control. And so when young women and girls find themselves in situations like this, or, you know, being sent off to stay with a family friend for a while, which was my experience, or, you know, there's a variety. And it's frightening, honestly, to think about how much different my life could be if I had just been born in a different time period. And it's frightening to think about how quickly things can change, how quickly the rights that we think that we are entitled to and that are protected can just be completely thrown out the window. And it happens every single day. And it is never not absolutely terrifying. And I am so incredibly thankful for the fact that I grew up in the time and the place that I did, in a culture where sending your children off to be, like, incarcerated, it was really not in vogue in any way, shape, or form. In this country, we do have something, and maybe it's worldwide too, but it's become very well known here, the troubled teen industry, or TTI, which was this entire industry built around dealing with behaviorally challenged children in a way that was supposed to help, allegedly, but now, based on the testimonies that are coming out from the children, now adults who actually went through the TTI, it was not helpful in any way, shape, or form, and bears a lot of similarities, frankly. I think the playbook for controlling people and their lives is very well established, and I think that we can see that in this case. You see it in Opus Dei, you can see it in the TTI. It's already well known what you need to do to subjugate and control people, and I think that's why you see the same things replicated over and over and over again by these authoritarian regimes and organizations, just because it works so well. So finding my place in this article, I'll keep reading. The Patronato had the power to detain any non-conforming woman under 25. The youngest age that I read was 8 years old. 8-year-old little girl was apparently a fallen woman and needed to be incarcerated. They weren't criminals. They were females deemed in need of re-education, conform or die. But Mariona never learned the stories of the others she was confined with. They didn't let us talk. It's quite incredible, she says, and you wonder, how did they manage it? The control was complete. The internees were only allowed to exchange simple greetings with each other, a form of control and a way of preventing bad girls from influencing others. Gotta keep people locked down. Can't give people an opportunity to communicate, commiserate, comment on the experience that they're living in, because then they might be able to start organizing. And when people organize, the many become greater than the one. And that's something that every authoritarian regime recognizes. They will be unable to stop. If people galvanize, come together, link arms, the power is with the people, always. It's always with the people. And these authoritarian regimes do everything that they can to convince everyone that that is not the case. But it always is. She thinks there were around 100 internees at the convent. They slept 20 to a room with a nun at one end and the door locked. The daily routine was grueling. Prayers, mass, cleaning the convent, and then hours in a workshop making clothes for local retailers. While the girls sewed, a nun read aloud so that no one talked. There was indoctrination, recalls Mariona, so that you should understand you'd behaved very badly. Then, once you realized this, you'd ask for forgiveness and confess. Mariona never confessed. The goal is to break these young women's minds and spirits completely, to put them in an environment that is so untenable that they have no choice but to get on board with fascism and everything that it was trying to tell them about their place and station in life as women. After around 4 months, she was allowed to return home to Barcelona for Christmas, but wasn't permitted to go out alone. Somehow, and Mariona doesn't remember how, she managed to escape, but her escape was short-lived. Within hours, she was bundled into a car with her father and an uncle and driven back to Madrid. We arrived back at the convent at dusk, she recalls. I refused to go in. They pulled me up the stairs and gave me a sedative to get me inside. Drugging women and dragging them in was the only way that they could do this. And 2 men did this to a young woman, a teenager. Inside the convent, the other young women were warned against talking to her, the rebel girl who had the nerve to try to run away. She grew intensely lonely and eventually began refusing food. Dramatic weight loss resulted in her admission to a psychiatric clinic. There, she says she was given 2 sessions of electroshock therapy, followed by what was called insulin coma therapy. Mariona says she was injected with insulin to induce deep hypoglycemia, a coma-like state caused by low blood sugar. It was believed this could reduce psychotic or schizophrenic symptoms and somehow reset a patient's brain. My question here, was she ever actually diagnosed as schizophrenic? I mean, whether or not that even means what people think that it means is neither here nor there. But they did not mention anywhere in this article anything about Mariona being schizophrenic, having been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So that's kind of a red flag to me in a really, really big way. The fact that she had to be drugged so much, another really, really big red flag. Electroshock therapy is not commonly practiced anymore, and there are very, very good reasons why it can do a lot of damage. And this insulin coma therapy just sounds really, really bleak and dark. This is what I have begun calling the abuse of psychiatric medicine, APM. It's something that is not uncommon within influential and powerful authoritarian organizations. It is something that numerous former members and investigative journalists and activists exposing Opus Dei have talked about existing within Opus Dei. And stay tuned about that because I have more coming out, but I have gone down the rabbit hole on the whole Opus Dei APM thing and the prevalence of psychiatric medicine in Opus Dei, and apparently to suppress and control people, is too common to just like ignore or boil down to like a random one-off here and there. I think that there is like a systemic issue going on, and I think it's necessary in order to control people. Just like in this situation, these young women are being drugged in order to be able to control them, because they would not get on board with and conform to the very narrow and limited lane that Franco's regime had identified for women to occupy. And she says in this article that this insulin coma therapy, the practice has been discontinued in many countries because it can be lethal, just like electric shock treatment. If incorrectly administered, or if you don't know what you're doing, you can cause lasting damage to a person's psyche, to a person's physical and mental health that they will never be able to recover from, and that's really serious. I don't think that we are taking this whole drug thing nearly seriously enough. Maybe here in the United States, it's because of the fact that we have pharmaceuticals shoved in our face like every single time we turn around. They're in YouTube ads, they're in TV ads, they're in radio commercials, they're on billboards. Like literally, you can't go anywhere without big pharma trying to like shove pills down your throat. So perhaps, at least in this country, people are desensitized to this type of thing and simply don't see like rampant over medication as like a red flag, when I think that, especially in this context, it absolutely is. Mariona received an insulin injection in the mornings. Later, she'd be brought out of the coma and made to eat. Mentally, she began to shut down. Well, yeah, you have no life. You have no autonomy. You have no ability to be your own person. You're just like a thing that they're powering up and shutting off as it suits them in order to control them. And that is so incredibly dark. She says, every day I was more dazed. I started saying things like, I hurt my parents, she says. I entered this process of submission and acceptance. Mariona believes the forced intravenous treatment with insulin irreparably damaged her memory. Suspecting it was causing her to forget things, she began keeping a diary. More than 5 decades later, this faded paper document from 1971 would inform Marina's documentary about her mother's experience. Doctors believed the treatment would help Mariona gain weight, but that wasn't happening. One day, the psychiatrist decided it was better to try tying me to the bed until I ate. Mariona's despair became so unbearable, she says she thought about taking her own life. And who wouldn't in a situation like this, where you're basically like you're being held hostage, like chemically? What a horror. You can't even be in your own mind. They've completely taken over that as well. The psychiatrist gave her a target weight of 40 kilograms. I'm not exactly sure how much that is in pounds, but presumably a healthier weight than what she was at. And if she achieved that, they promised she'd be released from the clinic. Mariona succeeded, and in 1972, once she'd grown a little stronger, she returned to Barcelona. Now, aged 20, she vowed to never live with her parents again, and I cannot blame her. If my parents did something like that to me, I wouldn't even talk to them ever again, frankly. These were the final years of Franco's dictatorship before his death in 1975. Mariona moved from job to job, eventually forging a career as a TV director. She had children of her own, but her relationship with her parents remained cool. At some point, Mariona asked her mother why she'd been sent to the Patronato. Her mother only said, "We made a mistake." Mariona's father is in his 90s now, and he said, "We suffered a lot too," when she asked him about the family decision to have her locked up in Madrid. And that is really tough, and goes back to like what I was saying earlier about how, there are people in these environments, everyone, nobody gets to like behave as an autonomous and independent individual, especially in something like Franco's Spain, which was just so like all encompassing and completely just like swept over the entire country, the control was really, really extreme. And so I am sure that Mariona's experience, sad as it is, tragic and unnecessary, is not uncommon, and that there are probably more than we will ever know people who, women and girls, who were handed over by their family members, and that causes generational trauma and breaks apart families in a way that is really, really insidious. And I have a hard time believing that what they were doing would have like I don't think that it did any of the things that they were saying it was going to do. But of course, that was never the point. It's always been about control. I think it's vitally important to remember that this was never about actually helping people. It was about controlling them at all and any cost. For Marina, learning more about her mother's story has complicated her relationship with her grandfather. I can't force myself to love someone who's caused so much pain, who treated my mother very badly. And I completely understand. I do not have relationships with people who are technically related to me by blood because of the harms that they've inflicted on myself and my loved ones. I don't let people like that stay in my life. And I cannot, it's not within my ability to treat these people with love and care and as like a member of my family. I'm at an age now where I have the ability to choose my family, and when people have caused pain and trauma and heartache, regardless of whether or not, you know, it was something that they did completely willingly, you know, maybe they were also under duress or in an environment that was not empowering them, but it really doesn't matter. Two wrongs don't make a right, and there is personal accountability for everyone. At the end of the day, we are all living and dying by the choices that we make, and that includes the choices that we make on the behalf of other people like your children, for example, who are going to grow up and will have to contend with life as they find it, and will have to do so with the tools that you equipped them with, or they will have to go and find their own if you failed in that. And I don't think that there is a problem with people choosing who they have in their life. And I don't think that there is a problem with cutting people out who are harmful and toxic, even if those people are technically related to you by blood. They say that blood is thicker than water. That may be true, but that really doesn't mean anything. So what? I'm still going to be swimming my way out of it either way, because I know the kind of life that I want to have. I know the kind of people that I want to have in my life. And I know the kind of behaviors and treatment that I will and will not stand for. The short documentary Marina produced about her mother's experience of the Patronato is called Els Buits, Catalan for the Spaces, a reference to the blanks in Mariona's memory. The film has won prizes in Spain and was nominated for the prestigious Goya Award. 50 years after the death of Franco, the film has contributed to a groundswell of calls for the interned women to be formally recognized under the law as victims of Spain's dictatorship. Spain's Minister for Democratic Memory, Angel Victor Torres, said his government was open to looking at the case of the Patronato survivors. Meanwhile, Marina and Mariona are on tour with the film, taking it to community screenings. Women come and tell their stories. It's like a door open to something unknown, and that's very powerful, said Marina. People think that what happened in their own home was an isolated incident. We try to say this history isn't individual, it is systematic. Her mother, Mariona, still doubts her memory sometimes, but she says seeing it all reflected in the film, that gives it the weight of truth. And they have a note here at the bottom. It says that if you've been affected by issues involving suicide or feelings of despair, details of organizations offering advice and support for people in the UK are available from BBC Action Line. They have it hyperlinked, and then help and support outside the UK can be found at Befrienders Worldwide. In addition to that, I also like to mention that I have a list of mental health resources down in the description that I put together. They are not just North American. I've tried to find mental health resources for as many countries, continents, regions that I could. Unfortunately, mental health resources are something that still are very difficult to access in a lot of parts of the world. So I can't guarantee that what you need will be there, but it may get you on the right track. So if you or someone that you know needs help, those resources are there, and please utilize them and reach out, because life is very hard. All of this shit does not make it any easier, but we do not have to go at everything completely alone or unequipped, and there are people who do want to help. We have to take those first initial steps for ourselves to try to reach out. And I know that that can be a mountain of a thing to overcome in and of itself, but please do try, because life is worth living. Your life has value, and you belong here. The final article that I'm going to read, I probably will not read this in its entirety, but there were a couple of interesting things that the author brings up that I wanted to kind of point out and sort of call out. This is a Global Sisters Report, which is a project of the National Catholic Reporter. It's the Catholic news site, news agency. I've read their articles before and like newsroom analyses and that kind of thing. I don't always agree with everything that the writers have to say, but they are contributing to this like evolving conversation about raising awareness for human rights just around the world, but then also within religious organizations as well. And so this article, the headline says, "Not forgotten, not forgiven, say the survivors of the Patronato to the Church in Spain." And this is in reference to a congress, a concert, like an organization of, what am I trying to say here? A conference was put together to bring people together to tell their stories and to give some of these entities, like representatives of the Catholic Church, for example, an opportunity to say, hey, we hear what you went through, we recognize what you went through as very real, and to offer apologies. And it wasn't actually received very well by everyone, which is really, really unfortunate. But also not surprising, because the bar is in hell at this point, and a simple apology, just saying, hey, we're sorry that happened to you, that's not going to be enough when you're talking about the broad scale of the like impact and damage that have been done to people's lives. So I'm scrolling through here. If you want to read this whole thing, you can find it down below. A lot of it just repeats what I already read. But the Spanish Conference of Religious, or CONFER, Confer, held a public event to acknowledge and seek forgiveness, like I had said. But it didn't go as planned. A lot of the women responded with a resounding no. Their decades-long anger spelled out in bold letters on signs. Many survivors attended that day, rejecting apologies with cries of truth, justice, and reparation, and not forgotten, not forgiven. And so I think it is understandable why these victim survivors and their descendants are having the feeling that they're having. I think it is only understandable given, again, like I said, the scale of what was done to people, and the fact that nothing in the way of like support or anything was provided to these people for far too long. And so again, simply coming out and saying, hey, we're sorry, we hear you, it is a good thing to do, but it is not enough. It is not enough to simply apologize and then move on. There has to be something more that is done when you are talking about the ruin that is inflicted upon people, women and girls, who are victimized by this thing. The author says, "Those cries slipped through the cracks of my own wounds. I wasn't there, I'm not Spanish, I don't belong to any of the congregations that ran those centers. I don't even share the same historical context, but I am a consecrated woman, and that is enough for me to feel some of the weight of that institutional responsibility. The church isn't just history, it's also a body, and I am part of that body. I chose to be a part of an institution that, while it has given me much, has also hurt me." And this is a duality that I wish I saw reflected in more Catholics more often. I wish that there was this kind of like sort of, I don't know, just like the awareness of the fact that the thing that you are a part of has caused quite a bit of harm all around the world to billions of people. And that has to be accounted for. You can't just say, well, you know, there's a few bad apples. You'll have that with any organization or any group, and that doesn't detract from the good things that they've done. Sure, it doesn't. But the bad was still done. And so that has to be accounted for. Let me put this in a theological context. You know, when I was going through prep for my first Holy Communion and my confirmation, I remember receiving quite a bit of lesson on how reconciliation as a sacrament and just as a theological concept more broadly works in the Catholic Church. The idea being that if you do something wrong, let's say you throw a baseball and it accidentally breaks someone's window. Well, you need to go and apologize for the fact that that window was broken. That is the first right thing that you should do. But the window is still going to be broken. Even if the owner of the house says, "Thank you for apologizing, I appreciate it," the window is still broken. The apology doesn't undo that. What are you going to do to right the broken window? In a theological context, if we're talking about the sacrament of reconciliation, going to confession, confessing the things that you've done, and seeking reparations, basically, or to do some sort of penance, is like the whole process. Well, it seems to me within a lot of these situations, half of that is happening, and the other half, the work that needs to be done after the fact to redress the wrong, isn't getting done. Even though I had always been told growing up that when you do something wrong, not only do you need to seek forgiveness for it, but you also need to try to make it right. That must happen. That must happen. Or it is an incomplete, apology. It is an incomplete contrition on the part of the offender. The author says that she understands the refusal because when the wound is inside and what was believed to be sacred and untouchable, forgiveness becomes a fragile ground. Forgiveness is expected and even idealized, but it is seldom accompanied. It is assumed that those who have suffered should have the capacity and the Christian obligation to forgive. Isn't this true? As if it were that simple. As if forgiveness were merely a rational decision and not a struggle that emerges from deep within, wreaking havoc on the stomach and making the whole body resist. Those who haven't been hurt in this way would never understand that sometimes forgiveness hurts more than the original offense, especially when it is requested without addressing the underlying wounds. I don't actually think that forgiveness must be a part of your healing journey. I think that for some people, it can be. I think that for some people, that can be an empowering thing to do, but I don't think that it is for everyone. And furthermore, I actually don't think that everyone who has done wrong deserves to be forgiven for that wrong. Some things are unforgivable, actually, patently unforgivable. And I don't think that you need to forgive the person that did those things to you in order to heal. Because I think you can heal just fine while also still holding that the thing that happened to you was wrong and should never have happened, and that the people who did it to you were wrong and should be held accountable. Maybe that's a hot take. I don't know. But I do know that within religious environments, the idea is always that you forgive, and you forgive quickly, and then you move on because, Jesus said, forgive your brothers 70 times 7 or whatever it was that he said. So there's this idea baked into Christianity as a whole that you must forgive and forgive quickly. I don't agree with that anymore. Maybe in a time when I was younger and growing up in that environment, I did. But now, as an adult who's lived life and had some experiences and been through some things that were not great, the idea of forgiving the people who were responsible for the things that I went through or contributed to hardships that I've endured or anything like that, I don't feel the need to reach out and say, hey, you were a shit person, but I forgive you. No, you don't get that forgiveness. You don't. There are some things that are unforgivable, and I don't think you have to forgive people for it. And I think it's a nice idea, but I don't think that it is absolutely 100% necessary. And especially in this case, when you're talking about a human rights abuse of this scale, right? We're talking about deprivations of liberty. We're talking about forced incarcerations. We're talking about forced parent-child separations. We're talking about human trafficking, children being sold, babies being sold or placed with families that were more in line with Franco's idea of Spanish society or sent out into the world other places, these are all incredibly serious crimes that should incur serious consequences. And I think that it's insane to be looking at the survivors of the situation and their allies and be it in any way askance about the fact that they are not just welcoming this apology with open arms. I think it only makes sense. I think it's insane to expect anything different, frankly. And, you know, I don't know what this, the confer was expecting to come out of this, the Spanish Conference of Religious, if they thought that really this would go super smoothly, if they thought that they would get pushback, who knows? And I certainly hope that this is not like the final end of what we're going to hear, because like I said, something more needs to be done. And I would hope that that was something that Confer knew going in. And if they didn't, I hope that the response that they have received to their apology makes it plain. At this point in time, these things are unforgivable, and something must be done to redress wrongs and to help the victim survivors. Point blank, period. This entire situation is one that I think has implications for the times that we are currently living in, especially here in the United States, but there is a right-wing wave that seems to be washing over the entire world right now. It's happening in countries all around the globe. And history seems to repeat itself ad nauseum. And I don't even know, you know, I've said before that those who don't know their histories are doomed to repeat them. But sometimes I wonder if even being aware of our histories are enough. We seem to be caught in these cycles that just repeat over and over and over again. And nothing ever plays out exactly the same as it did previously. There are no, you know, nothing ever happens the same place, the same way twice. Lightning doesn't strike the same place twice, that kind of thing. But flavors of this entire situation, the control, the authoritarianism, the expectation that women will conform and get on board with what is being expected of them by their like society at that point in time, the force, those are all elements that continue to run throughout human history. This situation is just one very specific example, but there are many, many more. And these things will continue to happen anytime the people are disempowered and disenfranchised and taken over by an authoritarian regime. And there are many different factors that contribute to whether or not that happens. And I can only hope that by raising awareness and reminding people of these events, of this relatively recent history, of the impact that this type of thing has had on the lives of the people that it was allegedly supposed to be protecting, maybe we can spot this stuff when it starts to come up again. You know, it does make me happy to see so much discourse happening around our current governmental political administration with the president and everything, to see people pushing back against the rhetoric that is coming out of Washington, D.C. and out of some of these individuals. And I hope that we're able to do that in a meaningful way now that will prevent this type of thing from happening again, at least in our time here and now. We have to act with where we are, right? So thank you for your attention to this matter. Thank you for giving me your time. Let me know down below what your thoughts are on the Patronato. Was this something that you knew about before, or was this completely new information? If there is another similar program or situation, like I mentioned, the Magdalene Laundries, that you think more people should know about, feel free to mention it down in the comments below. I'm always on the hunt for new rabbit holes and new subjects to kind of learn about and go down and get lost in. So I'm always willing to take suggestions on board. And thank you so much to everybody who has up to now. You've helped inform my research so much, and that's been much appreciated. links to support me, connect with me on social media, all the rest are down below in the description. If you are interested in learning more about what I do, you can find all of that over on my YouTube channel and on my social media. And that is where I'm going to leave it for now. I will have a new video for you very, very soon, but in the meantime, I think it is more appropriate now to say this than ever. Just remember, nolite te bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.